Welcome everybody to Mindful Mondays with Laura Cross, where we provide resources, education, connection, and collaboration to support you on your life's journey. And today we are unlocking your living legacy with Greg Barnsdale. Greg is the extraordinary undertaker turned inspirational speaker. Facing a life-altering diagnosis, Greg's unique journey has given him a profound message that few others can share. As a certified financial planner, a certified executor advisor, and hospice volunteer, Greg's insights are like no other. His Living Legacy program encourages us to embrace our best selves, leaving a lasting impact on those around us. Greg, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. So tell me, you've recently published a book. It's called Do Not Ignore Your Mortality, Practical Tips from a Funeral and Financial Insider. What compelled you to write that?
Well, Laura, it was a labor of love, ironically. I had, after actually quite a long time working as a licensed funeral director, left that industry, maintained my funeral director license, and then worked for a number of years as a certified financial planner. And what compelled me really to write the book was what I had seen. I had, as a funeral director, I saw all kinds of situations where proactive planning was not done in advance of a death, and it created all kinds of problems. And I realized rather quickly upon entering that industry that a lot of people avoided speaking about death and those sorts of things. And then as a financial advisor, especially focusing in the area of estate planning and life insurance planning, I found the same thing.
Yeah, and those are really kind of tough topics, and I don't have the answer, but I always say, because I lost my husband about 19 years ago, and it's different when you have to call people and say someone just passed away than when you call someone and say, hey, I'm getting married, and you're all excited about it. So it's a tough topic, and you're right. It's not one I don't think that a lot of people really think about or talk about.
Yeah, I agree. And it's, to a large degree, we live in a death-denying society, and it's always been that case. But at the same time, society has a strong sentiment to remember the dead with Memorial Day and all the various activities in our world about remembering those who have passed away, etc. Yet at the same time, there's this issue or avoidance of talking about death, and it needs to change for the better.
Yeah, and I would say funerals themselves have changed a lot over the years because, of course, I was military. My late husband was military, so it was taken care of, had a military funeral. But nowadays, it's not necessarily a funeral. A lot of people call them a celebration of life, and there's a whole different outtake on that nowadays, too.
Yeah, there is. People don't necessarily see the value in traditional funerals as they used to, and it's forced the funeral industry across North America to change and keep up with the times. But you're right, things are always changing.
Yeah. Now, you also had a serious health scare yourself after you published this book, right?
I did. After decades of stressing to people, whether I was a funeral director or a financial advisor, about how important it is to have your final affairs properly in order, I had tried all kinds of things, Laura, that didn't work in trying to share this message and such. And then I finally figured out a good way to get my message out there was to write a really good book. And I think I've done that. But yes, 2 months after I published the darn thing, I was diagnosed with a large brain tumor.
Wow. Yeah. But that has since then been resolved and you're okay, correct?
Yes, it's if anyone out there happens to have a ringing in one ear, it's called tinnitus or tinnitus. The health community will typically request an MRI to be done, and that's when I didn't realize this until after the fact, but that's when they suspect it could be a brain tumor. And in my case, it was a fairly common acoustic neuroma, which is non-cancerous. And the neurosurgeon said I probably had this for about a decade. They took it out. I've got about a 6-inch scar up the side of my head here, which was rather scary to have done. I had to make sure all of my beneficiary designations were up to date for my wife and family. And prior to that, I had never had any type of health scare like that. But it really gave me an additional perspective that has kind of, I guess, ironically rounded out my experience in this area.
Yeah, and I guess kind of the thing is too is that you happen to write the book and you were already on this path before this happened, where there are so many of us that just once tragedy strikes, okay, now you have to think about it and it's in our face. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, you actually had it kind of a little bit ahead of time beforehand. So how long were you a funeral director?
Well, I've been a licensed funeral director, still am, since 1985. So it's, 4 decades, pretty well of being, having that license. And I've worked in the industry for well over a decade and worked around it in one way or another. But I find I can't shake it. Once you kind of get working in that industry, if you're passionate about it, it's something that's of strong members. None of my parents were in it. They thought it was a little bit off the beaten track to get into it, to be honest. But
Well, and yeah, you kind of think so, but on the other hand, if you've ever had to experience that, my hat's off to you because we need people that are passionate and actually put the family's concerns and stuff and not make it just such a cold
yeah,
process to go through. So my hat's off to people that can do that because they are very much needed. So we've touched on a few things, but tell me, because a lot of times why can't we just tell our loved ones what we want done? I mean, you've talked about executor because I know you're an executor advisor, and maybe you can share with them a little bit more detail on why we can't just say what we want done.
well, it's ironic you ask me this question here right now, Laura, because before this recording started, I was speaking with an old friend of mine who's also a funeral director, and his health is not well, and he was telling me about a conference call that he and his wife set up with his children who were out of the area with their financial advisor to go over all of their investments and such. And in the event something happened to he and or his wife, that the children would be up to speed and have a connection with this financial advisor. And I congratulated him on that. And I got thinking about all the situations that I have uh, been a part of and such in the past where people were just so reluctant to talk about these things. Uh, Perhaps many people want to maintain their privacy. Perhaps they're just uncomfortable talking about the future and what it holds for them. Perhaps I think in some cases superstition is involved. So it's really a number of things.
Yeah, which I could understand because I know members of my family have that all planned out, have the executor and all that stuff. And to me, I understand it. Well, I was hit with reality. I did not have all that stuff. I had a will in place. That was about it. The military took care of the rest because at 37 years old, who thinks you're going to be planning,
Yeah.
a funeral for your other half? But I guess sometimes it's a thing we relate to older age, but it's really not. I mean, it can happen at any time. So I would say it's good to be prepared. I guess what I'm saying is too is that I would struggle with people that like focus on it because some people like continually talk about this. I'm like, planning it is good and having it done, but it's not something that I would necessarily want to discuss all the time. You know what I
Yes.
mean?
Yes,
It,
and I've run into that too, Laura. A lot of people, some people have told me that they just don't want to talk about it anymore. And I get that. It can be very overwhelming for some people, and I guess maybe I'm inclined to talk about it. Perhaps, well, I'm sure more often because it's a passion of mine. But some people just aren't in that same space, and they don't like it. And I understand that it's an incredibly delicate topic, and just putting a will together can be one of the easiest things to put off. But you're right. It, we all need to have a will in place, and it's not just to dictate who gets what. It's a will is the only viable way of indicating after you're gone who is to wrap up your life. That's a pretty important topic.
it is, and it's I would say it's a lot that you're entrusting somebody else with. So maybe for those who don't know, because I'm familiar with an executor, but maybe you can let our audience know a little bit more what an executor is and what's the difference between an executor and an executor advisor.
Right. Well, I belong to the Canadian Institute of Certified Executor Advisors, and it's an organization here in Canada, which is actually just within the last month or so has expanded into the U.S. as well. But what we do I, my membership is as a funeral director, but there are also accountants and sociologists and all kinds of various people that belong to this organization who at some point can be working with an executor. And an executor, on the other hand, or a state trustee or executrix, if the person is female, is basically in charge of someone's estate. And that's what the will dictates. If someone has a current and valid will that is accepted by the court in the jurisdiction where they lived, that's accepted by the court, and then that person is in that role of executor. But if the person dies without a will, typically the court will then have to nominate someone, which can be quite a daunting and frustrating and lengthy task to have done. But then the person who is nominated is more so called, in quite a number of jurisdictions, an administrator. And their role is much the same. And they have to basically file tax returns and make sure all of the assets of the deceased are accounted for. And it's quite a lengthy task. And actually, if the executor handles the role improperly, they can now actually be sued. And a lot of people don't realize this. So with more and more rules coming into play as to how executors are to handle themselves, a lot of people just would never want to do it again.
Of someone's estate. Is that pretty much the only one, the main one, or?
Yeah, that's the main one. And I've heard it said, Laura, that some people have said being an executor is like having a really hard part-time job for a year or two. and I think that's very true. But when you consider it's often a thankless job that the beneficiaries are just eager to get their hands on whatever their entitlement is of the estate. And they don't necessarily understand checks and balances that the executor or executors, because there can be more than one, that they should be taking notes about everything they do, as an example, and allocating the time that they're involved with various tasks. So it's certainly not a role for everyone.
So an executor advisor, does that help other executors?
Yes. Yeah, certified executor advisors can help give guidance to executors. They don't typically do the work of an executor, but they can put them in touch with an accountant if the situation warrants that, or perhaps a lawyer or a financial advisor, or whatever the executor happens to be needing based on the situation.
Okay, because there can be a lot of moving parts with the topic that we're talking about. And I know we're not going to have time to, dive into all of them, but some things that come to mind is like if someone, like contests a will or goes against this, or if something has changed and maybe something wasn't updated. Is that something that you can kind of help guide people through? Because a lot of times people aren't going to know, I don't think, where to find that kind of information.
Well, yes, certified executor advisors and lawyers and financial advisors are all typically familiar with these sorts of things, Laura. But I don't know if I had previously mentioned this, but the work that I'm doing now in promoting my message in my book doesn't allow for me to have the time to basically be giving one-on-one advice to people. It's just not practical for me to do that along with everything else I'm trying to do. And I don't want to end up with a second divorce on my hands either.
I can understand that. Absolutely
Yes.
understand that.
Yes.
So, as we said, it is important to create a will, but why do you think maybe some people feel it's not worthwhile to create one?
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who feel that they don't have enough assets and stuff to go through all the hassle of setting up a will. It, I think, is one roadblock that stops a lot of people. Another one is cost, because they think of, I'm going to have to pay a lawyer a lot of money to have a will put together. But these days, you can actually have a will created very easily online for very little money. But this is a topic I gave specific thought to in my book. because I wanted to make it very, very clear to people that, yes, though you can open up one of these will planning platforms online and complete the will yourself, if there's cautions to that. And here's a quick summary of most of them that come to mind. If someone has young children that they're paying child support to, they shouldn't be doing an online will. They should be speaking with a lawyer, because there's complex issues that typical online will planning platforms don't generally take into account. If someone owns property outside of the jurisdiction where they live, they should be seeing a lawyer, not doing this online. If they have any complex type of, if this, then I want that to take place, they should be seeing a lawyer. So, or if they have any ownership interest in a business, they should be seeing a lawyer. But if someone's situation is very straightforward, it doesn't involve any complex types of scenarios like that, an online will could be a good fit for them. And as I said, it's relatively inexpensive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's good to know. And as you mentioned, so you're also a financial planner, correct?
Yes.
And you still are one?
Yes.
So, and I know a little bit from what I have gone through, but what is your perception of why it's important to have a financial planner when we're talking about this?
Well, a financial planner typically acts in many cases, Laura, like a quarterback. One of the most important things that a good financial planner will do is to sit down with the client and ask them about their overall goals and objectives. You know, where are they now, and where do they want to get to in the future, and help them map that out and plan it accordingly. And then bring in the other people that may be needed to help them accomplish that. So whether it's a lawyer in regards to setting up some legal documents like a will or medical directive, or what we call here in Canada a power of attorney, or perhaps a business agreement with a business partner, or an accounting advice. But it's a financial planner who typically spearheads a lot of those types of conversations and brings in those other professionals to help them. And one of the things that I had read recently about financial planners in general here in Canada anyway, is that FP Canada, and that's the organization that holds my certified financial planning designation, they're a very highly respected organization here. They had a study that came out not too long ago that indicated a much higher percentage of people who engaged a certified financial planner had so much more confidence in their future. I'm not phrasing it quite the way they did, but it was quite compelling. And I wrote about it in my book too.
Awesome. Yes, you have a lot of this information, I know, for people in your book. And it's great that you have all these backgrounds. It doesn't stop there, though, either, because I believe you also volunteer in hospice.
I do.
Correct?
I do. Yes. Actually, the client that I had been seeing just not long ago, he died actually 2 weeks ago, which is not a surprise. People in hospice die, and that's generally why they're there. But just last night, I was actually at his wife's home visiting with her, and just trying to help her out a little bit and be an ear that she could lean on. But hospice needs more people to help them with these sorts of things. There's a growing need for this in our society, and it's such a worthwhile and helpful thing to do. And I've enjoyed every moment of it, actually.
Yeah, I know part of your title, I noticed you call yourself a death doula, which is the first time I've actually heard that together. I'm used to doulas that, help bring life, but I guess of course, you are on the other end of it. But it's just as important, I believe, to provide that kind of comfort, peace of mind, and I don't know, make the transition as easy for people as possible. During a tough time.
It is, and that's one of the things that hospices in general are trying to really share this message with society in general, that it's although hospice care is somewhat new, at least to a degree, the services that they offer are so unique and so valuable to families that are in that type of situation. It's not just for the person that's dying; it's for their family members too.
Yeah, because it really does affect everybody. Now, I know we have more to talk about, especially about your living legacy, what that means and everything, but we need to take a quick break from a word from our sponsors, and we will be right back.
Hey, we got soul. Oh yeah, we got soul.
Why are so many people reluctant to discuss end-of-life issues? It is an uncomfortable topic. It can be overwhelming, and in some cases, superstition is involved. The reality is that avoiding these types of important conversations can often lead to many problems occurring. However, proactively discussing our final wishes has so many benefits, two of which are less stress and a greater appreciation for life. Go to donotignoreyourmortality.com to learn more.
Hi, I'm Bobby Aldridge with BAM Metrics. There are so many programs out there that measure your swing speed, sets, reps, your BMI, your body fat, but the one thing they're not measuring that's so essential is mobility. Mobility is the key. If you're measuring your mobility, your performance will get better and you will reduce your pain. I created BAM Metrics to make it easy for people to repeat the exercises so they could do it properly at home on their own. It's simple, it's easy to do, and from a senior to a pro athlete.
So, Greg, you talk about a legacy. What do you mean about legacy?
Well, legacy is we're building a legacy every day that we're alive, with relationships with our children and those that we love and care about, and all the things that we do that people will remember us for when we are no longer here, which hopefully is a long way off, right? But we just don't know that.
Right.
But creating a legacy can be as let me rephrase that. One of the most important things regarding a legacy is always trying to keep in mind, in my opinion, and I think there's a growing number of people who tend to agree with this, to always keep in mind that at some point we're not going to be here. We don't know when our death will take place. So if we're always keeping in mind, how can I make things easier for those that I love and care about? And one easy example of that everybody can relate to is simply keeping track of your online login credentials somewhere, somehow, so that those you care about, like a spouse or whoever, can easily access them if God forbid you're in a hospital or in a coma, you can't make decisions for yourself and they need to log into different platforms, which we all have to these days. But that's just one way of it's an easy thing to do, to let your family know where you keep these things, because if you don't, it can create such a huge mess.
Yeah, it can, and it can create a lot of stress too.
Yes.
So what are you referring to when you're talking like a living legacy?
Well, the time that we can create the legacy that we want to live on after we are gone is obviously we need to be doing this when we're alive. So that's kind of the idea behind a living legacy, because once we're gone, we don't have that choice. So doing these sorts of things has so many benefits. And again, I read about this in my book, but one of the most important things that proactive end-of-life planning does is that it actually reduces the stress of aging. Because if we're putting our affairs in place and we're setting up things so that our those that we love and care about will be better off and more organized, it helps reduce that stress. But the other thing that it does too is that it also leaves our survivors more resilient, more financially resilient. And life insurance is just one example of that. And I've talked to hundreds of people about life insurance and sold lots of policies and talked to people in some cases who just didn't think it was for them, etc. But quite often, quite a number of the people that I had spoke to when I worked as a financial advisor, going through an assessment, and based on the answers and feedback that they gave, quite often we discovered that they were underinsured and they should be buying more insurance to accomplish what they want, or to have the money for their children, or pay off debt, or whatever. But that ultimately makes our family more financially resilient. And I think going through a lot of these things also leaves them more emotionally resilient, especially if they're involved in these conversations leading up to it, like my friend that I had spoke to just a little while ago before this type of this podcast. But another aspect of what estate planning and end-of-life planning tends to do is to also benefit charities, because in Canada, involving charities within your planning. So that's another big benefit of legacy planning. And this also leads to more meaningful legacies. If people take the time to think about this and create the sorts of things that they want after they're gone, well, they're going to have, obviously, a more meaningful legacy. And ultimately, this also takes an immense pressure off the court system, because they're not forced to deal with so many unorganized estates. And ultimately, all of these sorts of things, even contributing to survivor mental health, etc., ultimately improves the economy and saves money in so many different regards. So it's a win-win situation really for everyone. And that's why I'm really promoting all these benefits of proactive planning.
Yeah. And you mentioned mental health. So you would say that mental health would improve if people were better organized and planned and had this all together, correct?
I am, yes. No, I'm not a psychologist, or
Right.
I've never worked in that sort of field, but with all of these benefits that I had just mentioned about the greater resilience and family members coming together and talking about these sorts of things, and talking about the stories about grandma and grandpa, and there's all kinds of programs available online now where these types of stories and pictures and memories can be recorded before the person is gone. So all of those types of elevated engagements within family members tends to bring families together. And I think those sorts of things certainly help mental health. I don't know about you, but I've noticed on a fair number of the programs that I have occasionally seen about some people having issues with hoarding can come down to a previous death in the family.
Yes, I have seen that myself. Yeah. I was
So
going to say, you've been in this industry a while, so I'm sure you've probably seen your share of unusual things.
I have. I could. One comes to mind that is quite funny, that stands out in my mind, that I'll come to here in a minute. So don't let me forget, and I'll tell you
No,
about it,
no,
because
we'll do that. Go ahead.
I don't think you'll hear it from anybody else. But I truly do think that if people were to more so lean into these sorts of things, and more people are prearranging their funerals and buying insurance to set aside for their family when they're gone, etc. You see more and more commercials on television for final expense life insurance, etc. now than you ever had before, in my opinion. So people are to a point leaning into this more, and they have for the last number of years, but the statistics are still appalling. Here in Canada, survey after survey is revealing that only about half the adult population in Canada has a current and valid will. And those statistics in the US are roughly the same in the UK and Australia and so many other parts of the world. And it just needs to improve drastically.
So that before we get into those unusual stories, that brings up a question, because you said a current and valid will. So what makes it invalid?
Well, if wills, as I say in my book, wills date back to ancient times in Greece, actually. So wills are used all around the world, and they're just the fundamental way, the only way that you can actually, as I said earlier, dictate who's to wrap up your life. But what makes a will invalid is not following the laid out rules of the jurisdiction where you live. Here in Canada, as an example, you can in many of the provinces here in Canada, you can set up what is called a holograph will, which is a handwritten will that does not have to be witnessed by anybody, but it has to be laid out clearly and set up and well thought out, So a court of law will accept it, because a court of law, ultimately, whether someone has a will or they die intestate without a will, a court of law is involved. And a judge basically stamps it as being clear to proceed or not proceed.
Wow. Okay. I would also think, I guess, invalid would be like, say, if you got married or, things have changed and you never updated your will. So I would guess that would kind of make it invalid or not true anyway.
Well, that's a great point,
Your
Laura.
circumstances
And
changed.
that's right. And as our circumstances change, we have to stay on top of these things like beneficiary designations and so on. And again, it comes back to the rules of the jurisdiction where you live, and all the rules are different. They're kind of similar to a degree, but that's why it's important to get the planning initially set up. And if listeners already have it set up, that's great. But it's important to review it and involve your family and let them know what you're planning and so on. And you had mentioned about contested estates. I mentioned that in my book too. That if family members are involved in these conversations proactively before something happens, when all of a sudden a big health issue is on the table and everybody's emotions are running up here and etc., that's not the time to be speaking about these things. The time to be doing it is when things are normal, time is plentiful, and minds are clear.
Yeah. And that's a good point too, because like you said, during that time, your emotions are high. People react on emotions instead of maybe thinking things through logically. Sometimes it's hard to separate the logic from emotion, especially when you're in that time.
Yes, yeah, and that brings up another. When you mentioned this, Laura, I was thinking about the time I went to see my general physician, and I said, Doc, I got a pain in my neck. I don't know if it's because I'm sitting at the computer and I'm stressed out about trying to sell all these books that I've published, or the book that I published, etc. And he said, Greg, don't worry about that. You've got a bigger issue. You've got a brain tumor. I've just referred you to a ear, nose, and throat specialist. So I start driving, and I was in shock. I started to drive home, and my wife was working from home that day. And I thought, geez, how am I going to tell her this, that I got a brain tumor? And I was convinced it was cancerous, and he didn't know. He had referred me to an ear, nose, and throat specialist who 3 days later, just after the weekend, Monday morning, told me, oh, Greg, don't worry about it. It's probably not cancerous. You're probably fine. But we went through the whole weekend, and I didn't tell her for 3 days. It was terrible.
You didn't tell her for 3 days?
2
Wow.
days. I didn't tell her.
Well, still.
I didn't. And I finally tell her, and she's in tears, and Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On is playing in the background, and tears are running down my face. And I finally tell her, because she knew something was wrong. And then I let her kind of deal with it, and I didn't know what else to say. So I went out in the vehicle. We were going to go out and go to the mall or something to kind of get out of the house. And I turned my phone on. I did a quick little video thinking, well, I don't know if I'll ever share this or not, but I did a quick little video. And then my stepdaughter says to me, 2 days before my brain surgery, Greg, we should put that video on TikTok, and you got a story here, and it blew up. 1.7 million views it's been seen now.
Wow. I laughed only because it's just amazing of what goes through people's minds. It's kind of like when my fiance, had like gotten a car accident or whatever, and it's like he called work first instead of call. I'm like, no, I should be your first freaking call. I'm like, why are you not calling me? I'm just like, that's why it just blew me away. It's like, okay, because I'm sure that's got to be hard to hide, for one, if you've got a close relationship, and to not tell her for 2 days. You're going through your own torment by yourself. Yeah. And then, it's everybody process things different, not judging. It just amazes me of how people hit us. It all hits us differently. But
and people find this funny looking back on it, as I do too. But when I came back and I was putting the recycling out, and all of a sudden the ear, nose, and throat specialist secretary calls me and says, Greg, this is on Thursday, can you come in on Monday morning at 9:00? I was convinced I had cancer because they wanted to see me quickly. So I didn't want to ruin my wife's day. It was still the morning. I didn't want to ruin her work day. And then I didn't want to ruin her dinner. And then I didn't want to ruin her sleep. And we were all through Friday, and I told her Saturday morning.
Wow. So admirable for not wanting to ruin her day. Yes, but
it ruined her
Yeah,
weekend.
that's also kind of putting off the inevitable, not facing things, but probably.
Yes. But you know,
Yes.
Laura, when I told her and we kind of came to terms with this, that it could be cancer, and we were, as I said, both thinking that it was, it certainly grew us a lot closer together that weekend, for sure. We did a lot of dancing and just took a lot of time to ourselves. It was quite a special weekend, actually.
See, and I wish people would look at everyday life like that. We just get
Yeah.
so caught up and take things for granted until something like that hits us. Then it's like, all that stuff doesn't, crazy stuff we worry about just doesn't matter.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
tell me, like I said, I know you've got to have some unusual things you've seen. What are some things maybe you'd like to share?
well, I can't get into details with, this family or that family, but generally speaking, the most one of the more bizarre situations that I had seen regarding a death and working as a funeral director was the coworker and I. We were basically sent out by the funeral home that we had worked for, and I was the funeral director, and he was a part-time helper, sort of thing, an older fella. And we took the stretcher and put it in the vehicle and went to this apartment building where the police were. And because in that type of situation, you just basically meet the police, and that they take you in and you basically retrieve the body and bring the body out in a stretcher and back to the funeral home or to the hospital or a coroner's building or wherever. But this particular woman was standing up. She had died standing up.
Wow. I wouldn't even think that's possible. I would think you would just...
Neither did I. Or did the older that was with me. But anyway, or the police.
Wow.
The police had obviously, I don't know if many of them had seen it either, but this older woman, I don't know what her health condition was, but perhaps she had, what's that disease when your joints kind of lock up? Atherosclerosis or whatever. But anyway, her knees locked. So she had just basically just died in the kitchen. She was right in the corner where two walls meet, and that's where she was. She was actually standing up, and it was I'd never seen it before and never seen it since.
Wow. As I say, I haven't even seen a TV show portray that. So you know how they take the like situations. Well, I have never even seen that.
Yeah,
wow.
yeah, that's right. So anyway.
So I got to ask you, because I know when you had sent me over some stuff, what is a coffin club?
Oh, a coffin club. Yes, most people, I'm sure, have never heard of a coffin club. But I've read about that.
I've seen some things, but please tell me what that is.
Yeah, well, I read about it in my book. And actually, a retired nurse, sort of, if I recall correctly, I've got it in here somewhere. I'd have to find the page that it's written on or whatever. But if I recall, it was started out of New Zealand by a retired nurse who had a number of other friends that were interested in getting together and actually building their own coffin, not a casket like we see here in North America, which is straight down the sides like a fridge. But coffins are the term and style that is used often in Europe. And I guess New Zealand has that type of influence there too, where it's basically just wider at the shoulders and then tapers down, like what you see on Dracula movies, that sort of stuff. But anyway, they're very ornate and quite nice too. But coffin clubs actually were started in New Zealand by groups of people who just want to build their own coffin, their own container that they basically want to be buried or cremated in. And it's grown in popularity since then. I think she started them, I don't know, 15 years or so ago now, but they're all over the world now.
Wow. Yeah, I was going to say, well, we've been down to Branson at Ripley's, believe it or not, and they actually have these very elaborate, decorated like coffins, and I forget what country it is that it was very popular, but it just reminds me of my fiance always saying, "Well, just bury me in his race car, he'll be fine." I'm like, I don't think they'll approve of that around here, but so when I saw your thing about Coffin Club, I was just curious.
Right. And for anybody that wants to be buried in their car or anything like that, I have seen the occasional article about that sort of thing, and it might be difficult to pull off. But again, you would, if somebody was really serious about these sorts of things, and we should be about what it's the last time that we have control over what happens to us, and I think we should have that control. But pre-planning is so critically important, because then if there are things that you're thinking that you want, you can arrange for it or find out if it's even possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we have more to discuss about your book, but because we still have plenty of time here, where is the best place for people to get a hold of your book?
Well, the best place is actually on my website, donotignoreyourmortality.com. And thank you for that QR code coming up there. But on all the pages of my website, you'll see different reminders about how to order the book. But it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iTunes, Audible. In other words, it's available in paperback form, ebook, and audiobook. But it's starting to really get some traction now. It's taken a bit of time. I published it in January of 2023, but it's been on the Friesen Press, my publisher's website, bestseller list twice already.
Wow, and that's incredible. So, what can listeners expect from your book? I know we've covered some of the things, but what can they expect from your book?
Well, it's a different type of book. Here's how I started it. We've got a few minutes. I just want to read just a very tiny bit, Laura, about how I started this, because I followed the teachings of a very, very popular nonfiction author here in Canada by the name of David Chilton. And he actually became a dragon on Dragon's Den. And I'm sure all the listeners out there have heard of Shark Tank.
Yes.
Right. Well, this fella, David Chilton, was a dragon on Dragon's Den, which was the precursor to Shark Tank. And he did very well. And he's a super great fella. And I've been studying his masterclass about how to create my book. So he said to start the foreword in a very unusual way, which would capture attention. So this is what I came up with. To all the dead people I have met over my career, I am sure many of you did not have your affairs in order. The endless stories I have heard and overheard from your grieving relatives and friends clarify that many sour situations like yours could have been avoided. This has pushed me to the point of taking this bold stand. My commitment to all of you is to inspire many others to have their affairs organized. We both know the lingering regrets of not being prepared last an awfully long time. So it's, again, just to capture attention. But this book it's a short read. People can easily read it in one sitting. And it's really just a conversation starter to get people thinking about how serious this issue is, how important communication is, some of the basics around funeral, burial and cremation planning, and some of the basics around estate planning, life insurance and investments, beneficiary designations. And then the last chapter talks about medical directives and powers of attorney and how important they are. And after that is a fairly extensive glossary that explains a lot of the terms from both the funeral industry and the financial planning industry that many people have told me is really good.
Yeah, and that is incredible, because like I said, when you get hit in the face with that and then you got to figure it all out, it's nice that, you put that together. Which brings up, we've talked a little bit about age and stuff. What age or when would you recommend that people start like kind of doing a will or putting that in order? I mean, we don't want to dwell on it every day, but when would you start?
I would say today is a great day.
I mean, particular age or,
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. No, I hear. I'm just being a little.
No, it's
funny.
Great that we can put some humor in, because it's normally considered a fairly dark subject. So it's nice.
Well, it is, yeah,
light and have humor.
Yes, if we can add, and that's what I did with this book. Actually, I added a bit of dry humor to it that talks about. Anyway, you'd have to read it to get the humor, the timing of it, I guess. But every adult should be talking about, not, as you said, not dwelling on it, but at least set up the basics of what they want to have happen. Here's just one example. Have you ever heard of what is called the hallway huddle?
No, I have not.
Okay, well, it's a term that I heard of not long ago, which apparently a number of people is the type of situation where family members all of a sudden are forced to gather together outside a loved one's room in a hospital to discuss what the heck is going to happen next. And I can envision this. I've seen it. I've been to the hospital to pick up the deceased in so many different cases, and the family's off to the side, or they're in the room and they're crying, and in so many cases, as I said in the foreword to this book, these sorts of things can be avoided by some proactive planning when times are good and minds are clear.
I could agree with that, because I have unfortunately been in those hallway huddles a couple of times.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can relate to that and know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And that's a part of the humor that I put into this book that I wrote, Laura. The time to be, let me back up for a minute. Can you imagine when someone is in a hospital, we're sending cards of sympathy, we're sending flowers, we're saying, keep getting stronger, and you'll be out of here soon. I remember when my mom was in the hospital 4 years ago after breaking her hip, and she said to me, "Oh, God, Greg, I just want to get home with your father." And we've all been there and kind of said these words of encouragement. Well, just do what all the doctors and nurses tell you, and you'll get home in no time. Well, she actually flatlined in front of me the next day, was put on life support, and died the next morning.
Wow.
But we don't know what's going to take place. But can you imagine asking someone who's in the hospital trying to get better, do you have a will? Where's your will? Do you have a medical directive? If you pass out here and we don't know what to do, should we keep you alive? Should we pull you off the life support? Do you want a wood casket? Do you want a metal casket? We don't have to. Well, that's
no, and that doesn't come across very positive. Like,
no.
Hey, we're looking forward to you getting out of here.
No.
It's kind of like, okay, we're going to finalize you, and let's just get,
we don't do that, right? That would be crazy doing that. That would have broken my heart to have that type of conversation with my mother laying there. But as I said, the time to have these conversations are when we have the time to do it, and things are normal.
Yeah. So I guess if you're young, as soon as you're out on your own or living on your own, would probably be a good time.
Yes.
To create your own will.
Yeah.
Not wait.
Yeah, exactly. And especially if that young couple has young children, because that's another sticky point that a lot of people don't realize, is that if something happens to the parents and they're dead and gone, well, if they don't have a will in place, now the courts have to decide who's going to look after those young children. And they could have said to a sister, brother, or somebody, well, you look after the kids if something happens to us. And I think far too many people assume, well, if my wife dies or my husband dies, there's still one of us here to look after the kids. I don't need to bother with a will. I don't want to think about it anyway. But think about all the times you travel together in a car or on a plane, and couples die together fairly frequently.
Yeah. Yeah, either through an accident, or then there's ones that will die flat out of heartbreak from losing the other one. There's been a number of cases.
Yeah,
or I think would make it easier. I would think there's some comfort and, like you say, a better mental health if you carried out that person's wishes and what they wanted, and you didn't have to scramble or watch it go through whatever courts, probate, and watch somebody totally destroy and not do what that person wished.
Yes, yeah, that's right. As many people in the estate planning field and financial field tell people that if you die without a will, the government has a will for you, and basically what they're referring to is the fact that all of these different provinces and states and jurisdictions have rules in place for people who die without a will, and the way that things will play out will not likely be in line with what the deceased wanted.
Yeah, it's the only reason my husband and I had one was because we were both active duty military. And when you are military, they make sure you have a will. And it was pretty straightforward. Anything happens to me, it all goes to him. Anything happens to him, it all went to me. So, it made it easy. But I remember having to take care of affairs and called somebody, and they're like, "Oh, we'll just put it in probate." I'm like, "I mean, probate? I'm like trying to take care of it. I have." there's all kinds of stuff that pops up that you really don't need to deal with when you're trying to deal with the grief of losing someone.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And this kind of comes back to what you and I had spoke of earlier. People who have been in that situation and settled in a state as an executor or administrator quite often don't want to do it again. And I can't imagine anybody wanting to go through all those, jump through all those hoops often enough to get good at it, to ever want to do it more than they would ever have to. It's a really, it can be a very challenging job.
Yeah, I got good enough at navigating hospitals. That's as close as I want to get to it. But yeah, I would hate to say, I'm good at this. I've been through this a number of times. I mean, even after my husband and having 3 funerals, 4 hospitals to visit within 13 months after that, when I already had people coming to me saying, I don't know if I want to be friends with you. Everyone around you dies. It's like, okay, gee, thanks.
Yeah.
It's just life. And unfortunately, it is a part of life is death. And it is something we have to deal with.
Well, it is. And I've run into a fair number of people over the years, Laura, and I'm sure you have too, who are rather freaked out or superstitious about these sorts of things. And I'm not superstitious, and I don't think most of the people that I've ever met working in the funeral business are either. Otherwise, they wouldn't likely be working in it. But some of the perspectives, I just don't get it.
Yeah. Well, and I always tell people I don't judge because your perception is yours. You're entitled to it. Me,
Yeah.
you know what? I just want to enjoy what I'm doing. And if I go tomorrow, well, I died happy doing what I wanted to do. And that's it.
Yeah.
So what else? We have a few minutes left. What else do you suggest listeners do?
Speak with their family about what they want to have happen. Speak to their parents about what they want, and their grandparents, and learn from their grandparents and family members about the various stories that should be preserved and maintained. Now is the time to have these types of open conversations. But you had asked me before we started this recording, how could I sum up my message very briefly? And I think that the best way that I could summarize that, Laura, is to say, plan while you can.
That is true. Plan while you can, especially if you care where your things end up or where it goes. Or like you said, if you want to leave a legacy. I mean, there are, like you said, the charities, so if something's near to your heart and you want to make sure something goes in your name, that's pretty much the only way to do it and get it done is to have that all written down and planned out.
Yeah. I've included a clause in my will that if something happens to myself and if my wife is not here and something happened to her as well, I would want to make sure that our little Yorkshire Terrier Stella is looked after. So I've allotted a small amount of money for her to be looked after for a number of years. There's all kinds of creativity that you can work into this, but it's based on each person's individual goals and objectives.
Yeah, and there's really a lot of everyday little things that we just kind of take for granted and we don't think about. And your book will help them to think about that.
Yeah, well, that's precisely why I wrote it. And it took me so long to come up with a concept, Laura, as to how I was going to do this, because I wanted people to read it. I wanted them to get something out of it. But that's exactly what I stress to people, as I think you got with that introduction that I had read here, is that these sorts of things they're real. And death is around us all the time, but a lot of people are really just tuned out.
Yeah. Yep. I love focusing on positive things too. So I will admit it's not something that I revel in, but like you said, having your stuff and getting it in order, that can leave a lot less stress and on the loved ones that you're leaving behind, or because that can be really overwhelming.
Yes.
If you've ever been through that, it's very overwhelming.
It is, and I agree. I'm a positive person as well, Laura. I think after working in the funeral industry for a number of years, there's really no other mindset that you would come out of this with. but here's the positive spin on all this planning that I basically had said earlier. It sets up those that survive us. It sets them up for success.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are just about out of time, Greg. I want to thank you so much for coming on here. And I am glad we have people like you that do what you do, because it is a very much needed area for people, even though it's tough to talk about still sometimes, but it's very much needed.
Thank you.
So anyone that has had to deal with this or as he would say, plan while you can. I would definitely recommend you get Greg's book. It'll help you get through a lot of the stuff and make it a pretty seamless, or as seamless as it can be. It'll help guide you to creating that. And it's definitely an important part to help being mindful of what you're leaving behind, what you're doing, keeping all the stress off of you and off of others. Big part of it.
Yes, thank you.
So thank you so much. And everybody, we will see you next week. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful week.